Why am I talking about divorce? I have a number of viewers who really love my philosophically inclined videos, but I haven't done one of these videos in a while. But I was talking to someone the other day, a friend and supporter, and he's going through a divorce, and I don't know like hardly anything about it because I just don't have time most of the time to keep in touch with anybody. But hadn't talked to this guy. I heard from him forever, and it turns out he's going through a divorce. I'm not going to say any more, to identify him, but he's going through a divorce, and it seems like it's from how it sounds like it's one of the more amicable divorces. But it got me to thinking about this idea, because so many of us either are going through a divorce or will go through a divorce. I mean, I'm not married, but I'm doing fine in my relationship. It's nothing personal in that sense, but I am the child of a divorce, like a lot of you. And so a lot of us are children of divorce, or we've been through a divorce, or we will go through a divorce, or we're thinking about a divorce or whatever, right? It's a lot of people in society. And I guess this is my feeling, that I feel like the subject of divorce has not been done. I feel like divorce has not been given enough philosophical and attention, except in generally the most sort of cliched or obvious ways. So yes, if you go on Twitter, you're going to see a lot of people talking, bemoaning the fact that there's so much divorce in our society. Even though, in fact, as you may know, divorce has been on the whole declining since its heyday in what was it, the 70s or 80s, since it's the height of divorce. And I think you can look at that too. Honestly, y'all, I think you can look at that as a lot of pent up, repressed emotion coming out after the conservatism of pre-1970 society when we're talking about divorce. Those of you who were alive and adults back then, you might remember that divorce used to have an extremely powerful stigma in society that it no longer has. Yes, I understand that people still, and I'll talk about this in a moment, people still are bemoaning divorce, bewailing divorce, right? But it used to have a really significant stigma. And I'll tell you one way you can see this. If you look at the TV show Mad Men, remember, with John Hamm from years ago, and one of the main themes of that show, if you saw it, was examining, it was early 1960s, early 19 and late 60s, I guess it spanned that long, right, of America. And so at the beginning, in the first couple of seasons, it's very what we would think of as very conservative early 1960s America. And there's a character who is divorced. It's a female character. She's a neighbor of the main characters, right? So Don Draper, John Hamm, and his wife. One of their neighbors, a woman who is divorced. And there's a scene where there's a party, a birthday party or something for one of the kids at someone's house. And some of the women are standing around talking about this divorce character behind her back. And the tenor of the conversation is, can you imagine what that would be like? That's got to be so difficult. Oh my God, and it's in a very, very stigmatized way. And so a number of you, I just saw your comment, AJ, marriage is the leading cause of divorce. And I'm not, I'm not about to get into an anti-marriage diatribe with all of this. I know that at times I'm very non-traditional in what I say about things like marriage and child rearing and all of that. But actually, I think people are going to see I'm going in a very, I think, in a direction that's going to be charitable to a number of different perspectives. But anyway, and so there was this great, for a while, for a long, long time, right? Thousands of years, perhaps, or hundreds of years. I mean, the ancient Romans, for instance, seem to have an extremely laissez-faire attitude about divorce. And that may be because the ancient Roman model for marriage was one that was itself very divorced from any notions of romantic love or soulful connections or anything, and passion or anything like that. I mean, you can go, and again, you can look at the TV series Rome on HBO, if you ever watched that, which gets into this perspective. And so my point being is that, but certainly in American society, ever since the beginning, right, divorce has carried a really strong stigma until things began to loosen up, as you know, in the 1970s. And so that's why I think you see in the 70s and into the 80s this real explosion of divorces and then a decline since then, is because when something is new, when there is a profound earthquake in society, when what was repressed, people who are in dissatisfied marriages are now allowed to try something else, then of course for a while that becomes really popular. Then what happens inevitably is that people see that, perhaps in a lot of cases, the grass wasn't greener on the other side. Liberation, freedom, those types of individual freedom, they may not be, without their issues as well. The sexual revolution had considerable downsides. And so, people talk about the problems with promiscuity from a psychological perspective, whatever, right? But you see all of this. And so, of course, there was going to be an explosion and things were going to settle down. Hey, Dan, what's up? Glad you could join us. Contrarian Channel, a name that can be both attractive and repulsive. Dan says, here's some advice for any man, including Kurt's boyfriend. As soon as you get a date with Kurt's, pick up an engagement ring, just in case you ever have the opportunity to use it. Oh, well, that's nice. With a video like this, there's always, I think, a temptation to talk a lot about one's own situation or biography. But I've talked about it before on other videos, like with the twin flame thing. I've talked about how just in general, I have a real sense of trepidation about marriage, not so much about the concept of being with someone the rest of your life. I've been doing that for years now. God, I think it's like 13 or 14 years. But because marriage, from what I saw with my parents, it has such a strong negative connotation or feeling that perhaps in many ways might be irrational. That it's just not something that I've ever felt like I wanted to do. And I always thought that was something that you only want to do it if you really want to do it, right? But I don't know. I digress. So anyway, here's the point, is that we are now at a place where things have settled down and it seems like you have fewer and fewer divorces. But what I will say is this also, people point to the fact that also fewer people are getting married. So you can look at this, it depends on how you look at it and to what you see as positives and negatives of the situation. People who are getting married, staying together longer, but fewer people getting married. And, as my mom's generation and before might say, more people, living in sin or whatever, right? So my point is that this is something that I think that the narrative on this tends to get really one-dimensional on divorce. Tends to get really one-dimensional or two-dimensional sometimes online, particularly on Twitter, where you have a lot of people bemoaning divorce and a lot of people, saying how horrible it is that marriages never last anymore. And women are usually the ones who want those divorces, stupid bitches, stuff like that. And that's on the one hand. And then on the other hand, there's sort of this nonchalance about divorce that like the stigma is almost completely gone. And people just see it as almost an everyday of life. Yeah. A lot of people getting divorced or will get married. And if it doesn't work out, we can get a divorce, which I'm not saying I disagree with that perspective. Right. But I'm saying that to me, it just seems sort of this one or two dimensional thing. And what I wanted to do was actually dig into some of the, I think, deeper questions and deeper sort of philosophical concerns related to divorce. And so the first thing I wanted to look at, and by the way, I actually did spend a bit of time researching online different perspectives, popular perspectives on divorce. And like, for instance, there was one book that I found, it was a little outdated. So a lot of you could very much tell that it was from the 1980s, but there were still, in a number of ways, a lot of good points in this book. It was called The Good Divorce. And so anyway, but I was looking at these different sources and trying to think of some deeper, more helpful ways of thinking about divorce. And so I guess these are the questions that in my mind, I've boiled it down to, and I will dip into my own biography at times a bit as a child of divorce as I talk about this. But I think that there are several things here. One is that I think that even though divorce has lost the stigma that it did have pre 1970s, that at the same time, there are a number of ideas that have become in people's minds that have become inextricably associated with divorce, and it makes it difficult for people who are going through a divorce to go through it with a more positive attitude. And this is what I mean. the we all have, I think almost all of us have the assumption that children of divorce will inevitably be significantly damaged by that divorce, that going through that a divorce is something that is inherently a huge net loss for the children, and something that will do all kinds of psychological damage to the children, et cetera, et cetera, right? And so I'm not saying that this is right or wrong or whatever, but I'm saying that this is one of the points of stigma that have remained. And the problem with this, or where I want to come in and question a bit this idea, is that, first of all, I think that it's a pretty non-productive thing, a non-productive idea for people who are going to get a divorce. I understand that it might prevent some people who would get a divorce from getting a divorce if you remind them, oh, it's going to have this horrible negative effect on your kids, et cetera, then maybe you have fewer people getting a divorce. But for a lot of people who are going to be going through a divorce anyway, what I think it does is it sets them up at a point of failure before they even begin. In other words, the idea being that because divorce is supposedly just so inextricably linked to negative psychological experiences and disorders, and will really harm your kids, and is one of the worst things you can do for your kids, etc., that because of that, people who are going through a divorce, they tend to feel like, well, fuck, I've already screwed up like one of the biggest things that I could have screwed up as a parent. That's what you're telling me, basically. That there are these big things in life that are real punches to the gut of children, and completely, destabilize and disorder their lives, and all of that, and cause all of these deep, Freudian or what have you, psychological, ingrained psychological issues that they'll need years and years of therapy to get through, et cetera, et cetera. And people have then these really negative ideas in their mind. And so it sets up a kind of a self-defeating cycle in a way, because they already feel like, people going through a divorce with the stigma in their mind, they already feel like they're starting from a place of abject failure. Now, some people might say, well, divorce is really that bad, so people need to know it. Why are we pussyfooting around that for the feelings of people who are inflicting this on their children? Now, I'm getting real here about what people think, or what people have in their heads at times, that the guilt and the self-defeating attitude that they're weighed down with. What I would say to that, though, is that, and here's to me one of the most significant points, and it resonates with me on a personal level, thinking about my family situation, and also this is something that I've seen with some of the research and some of the sources that I've looked at, is that what damages children is not, on the whole, the act of divorce or the reality of separation itself of the parents. What damages children is all of the collateral damage that comes along with that, all of the behavioral problems, all of the ways in which, all the behavioral problems on the part of the parents, I should say, the divorcing parents, all of the ways in which the divorcing parents are acting out their own psychodramas and forcing these paradigms on their children, even unconsciously, the ways in which divorce is enacted in an extremely adversarial manner, and instead of what should be the opposite, ideally for the children, as a kind of a retrenchment, but a retrenchment on a new paradigm. So to me, it is more correct to say to someone who's getting a divorce, instead of saying to the person who's getting a divorce, oh, you're fucking up your kids basically by getting a divorce, what you say to them is, the way that you handled this can either fuck up your kids, or it can make this transition one that, while in some ways will be painful or unsteady at the beginning, can actually be I believe, relatively inconsequential to the child if it's done well. If it's done well, I think that. My parents were, they entered into a traditional marriage, and my mom was a virgin when she married. And they were very much, traditional Southern people, right? From lower class, or lower middle class, I should say, families, like rural families, right? And they were married many, many years, and they were miserable with each other and got progressively more miserable. And there was all kinds of unhealthiness and craziness and stuff that my sister and I were exposed to. And that doesn't make us any different from a lot of you, right? There are a lot of crazy relationships out there, and a lot of kids who've had to witness a lot of craziness. But I really do think that if they could have had a really amicable and well thought out divorce earlier on in my childhood and my sister's childhood, that it would have been much, much better for us. Now, what ended up happening was they were married until I went to college. And by then, my dad had like so many affairs, or been having affairs for so long, that my mom had just finally had enough. And she felt like, because she got me to college, she got me to the finish line, so to speak, in a way. I mean, a lot of people feel like this, right? Like, we'll stay together for the kids. And then when they go to college or they leave the house or whatever, then we can part, right? And so they got a divorce, and it was definitely not an amicable thing, but I guess it could have been worse. There wasn't a whole lot to fight over, right? But prior to getting a divorce, they did separate when I was in high school. No, middle school. Yeah, I think when I was in the eighth grade, they decided to separate for a year or two. And, even that was kind of a shock or a surprise, because I just figured that my mom would never do that. But because she was, my family, and she in particular, they were so into the idea of following the Lord's word and traditional marriage, and you stick it out, and all of that, right? But they did separate for a little while. And so this is my point. When they separated, and I was at home, and I was still a kid or an adolescent, I did get the sense through that separation of what it's like for kids to go through a divorce, because there were a number of things that happened with that formal separation that you would have happening in a divorce as well, right? And the thing that I remember is that it was the trauma or the pain of that experience as a kid was really very little rooted in the idea of the actual physical separation of the parents, or the fact that the parents no longer loved each other or wanted to be together. I mean, that was obvious, right? If you're living with people that constantly fighting, can't get along, there's all this poisonous, toxic stuff between them, and emotionally abusive and whatever from one side, and all of that. Like, yeah, you get the point. It's not, this is not a good situation. But so the separation in itself could almost be a sense of a relief. But what made it difficult was then the behavioral patterns that people engaged in, particularly I felt on my dad's side. So I think that is something that is a better point of focus for parents. And what I would say is, if you are getting a divorce, just my opinion as someone who doesn't even have children but was a child of divorce, if you are going through a divorce, I will say that I don't see where guilt or angst or feeling terrible about yourself is going to help your kids in the long run. I don't see. So I think that people who are going through a divorce, it's not only in their interest to let go of this stigma and to let go of this guilt and this feeling that they've ruined their kids, or that they've failed in one of the most fundamental ways that they were supposed to not fail. This is how some people feel. I think it's better for their kids as well that they let go of that. And then, in a very sort of clear-eyed, cheerful, positive way, as much as they can, to then move forward with that. Because if you're letting yourself get weighed down by all of this guilt, well, should I have stayed with their mother or father, and have I messed them up, and oh my God, for the rest of their lives they're going to be messed up by this and ruined. Just, that's not even necessarily accurate. I don't believe the research doesn't even bear that out. Put that away and say, all right, I'm going to do this. this task now that is before me, this path that is before me, this path that I've embarked on, I'm going to now do this as well as I can and with optimism and cheerfulness rather than feeling like it's this albatross that you're already weighed down with. Now, I don't like at all the idea of divorce as a failure either. And it's not because I think that, anything goes or all ways of living are equal or it doesn't matter one way or the other for your kid, whatever, family, no family. No, but I'm just saying that I don't think that looking at it in a bifurcated success failure way is an accurate way of looking at it. And I think that one thing that, how do I want to put this? I think that if people were more honest with themselves when they were getting married about what they were realistically doing, then there would be less of this sense of failure or angst when it comes to the divorce. Like for instance, let's think of it this way. Say that you could, instead of getting instead of marriage meaning the rest of your life, what if marriage was like a leasing program? It's like you lease a car. I'm not saying like this is the way it should be, okay? I'm just saying let's do this little thought exercise so I can make my point here. But let's say that you're leasing a car, right? So you have a contract for a particular period of time, and there are expectations between you and I guess the car dealership or whomever for a particular period of time, and it's understood that at the end of that leasing term, you might be induced to extend the lease if you've had a favorable experience and, maybe just fix whatever's broken by that time or whatever was been, banged up, no pun intended. Or you say, you know what, it's been an interesting journey. You've been a great Lexus or BMW or whatever. And so, but, it's time for me to now take a journey with the Camaro. What happened? I think if people looked at marriage like that, I think that there would be, I think that expectations would be more realistic and that there would be less angst and vitriol and sense of failure when one gets a divorce. Now, I understand a number of you might say, well, that leasing idea, that's not tenable for stable families or stable societies or whatever. I don't know, maybe not. I'm not going to be like Tim Pool and extrapolate from my personal opinions about divorce something much larger like the future of human civilization or whatever. I'm not saying that there's not value in thinking about those things, but I'm just trying to keep it a little more localized. And I do think, when you have kids, you really should try to sign on for the 18 years. Or I guess if you're having more kids, see, this is why it's important. Let me just say not to have kids until you're pretty sure of your partner, by the way. I understand people change. I understand that relationships evolve. Things can get really problematic that you couldn't have foreseen at the beginning, all of that. But like there are really too many people having kids who've not really thought this thing out or have not known the person that they're with long enough to be having kids. But let me just say, though, that I do think that when you have kids, certainly you've brought lives into the world that did not consent to be brought here and did not consent to be put under your care, as far as we know, unless before we are conceived, we souls are kind of flying around somewhere and we sort of plan out our lives. And then, like the movie, almost like Tenet, and he says, I am the protagonist. Like we've been writing our story the whole time. It turns out, perhaps. Really, I don't think it's a crazy idea. But I'm just saying that so far as we know, these beings, when you procreate, these beings that you bring into the world, they did not consent to be here or in this particular situation with you. So I do think that there is an additional burden, a much heavier burden, higher burden on the ones who are bringing the beings into the world. I think that a lot of guilt or a lot of this feeling about divorce as being a failure, I think that it comes in part from this perpetual seesaw in the minds of parents between the seesaw of never knowing if they have done enough as a parent. It's this constant seesaw of like joy versus guilt. Oh, there's so much joy when I have a beautiful experience with my child or when my child, has a breakthrough under my tutelage or however you parents think of it, right? So much joy. But then there's this guilt that seems to be often creeping up of like, what do I owe myself and what do I owe my child, when those two things seem to be in conflict? And I know, and divorce, the point is that divorce tends to really trigger this feeling. And I understand why, and I'm not saying that it's wrong that it does. But it seems like for a number of people, when they're trying to figure out whether to get a divorce or not, it's so often when they think of their kids presents itself as a binary where if I get a divorce, I am definitely screwing my kid over, so to speak. I'm definitely significantly damaging my kid. Versus if I don't get a divorce, I'm screwing myself over and very much damaging myself and continuing to live in bad circumstances or miserable toxic marriage or whatever. But my kid is not going to have to be a child of divorce, is not going to have to go through all of the pain and confusion and destabilization that's going to occur from the divorce, right? And so it gets in people's minds into this binary. At the same time, because so much of our modern society and the way that we look at love and romantic love in particular is now so tethered to the passion soulmate model, whether people want to admit it or not, that people and the idea of standing before someone and making this lifelong commitment till death do us part, it has been so mythologized in our culture. Everything from the wedding rings to the vows that people give each other and so forth. It's so been highly romanticized that when a divorce occurs, there's also this binary feeling of, wow, this was the beautiful vision of what it was supposed to be and forever and perfect unity. And this is what I did. I fucked it up, right? One of the major life achievements that people point to when they look at their lives, I want to have a good marriage. I want to have kids. I want to have a great career and whatever. And marriage, oh, and you screwed your kids over too. I just don't think that's true. But I think that one of the big things that parents have to do is to move past those feelings in their minds and realize that those are actually a distraction from the task at hand. And what's interesting from a Freudian perspective is how often in life we would rather cling to negative ideas because they give us an excuse. And I get this is where it gets interesting. Clinging to those negative ideas gives us the excuse that we secretly desire to abdicate our responsibilities. Because if you say to yourself, I fucked my kids up, I failed at this huge thing in life, then you don't really have an incentive to try beyond that, do you? If you've already failed, if you failed your wife, you failed your husband, you failed your marriage, you failed your kids, then you know what? You can kind of relax. Yeah, I fucked up my life. Okay, just do what I want. I don't know. I think it's an interesting idea. And this is what I love about Freud and a psychoanalytic perspective is that it shows us all of the ways in which we claim to be doing the opposite of what we actually are or feeling the opposite of what we're actually feeling. So I just don't think, I just deny that these negative stigmas associated with divorce are helpful to even the children. And so I remember what I was saying earlier, actually. I was talking about how I do think that it's good when you bring a non-consenting being into the world to try to keep the 18-year contract that's been recognized by our society, right? Now, you might say, why 18 instead of 15 or 25, right? We get into these arguments, too, when we're talking about age of consent, right? But I'm just saying, generally speaking, society has recognized that parents need to stick it out for 18 years. Now, does that mean you need to stay in a horrible marriage? Does that mean that you even necessarily need to stay in a very unhappy, unfulfilling marriage? I personally would say no, but these aren't my questions to answer. But I personally would say no. But I will say this. If you are going to get a divorce, then you sure as hell owe it to your children and to yourself to do it in such a way that 10, 15, 20 years down the road, you're not going to look back at it and be disgusted with yourself or disappointed in yourself. And your kids are not going to be able to look back at that sitting in a therapist's office and say, man, that whole experience really fucked me up. So what I would say is that I understand how difficult, from seeing what my parents went through, I understand very much how difficult it is to continue to be the nice person, or to continue to extend olive branches, or to conduct yourself with decorum and grace and love, and to refrain from talking shit about your ex to your kids and all of those things. I know how difficult it is to do when the person that you're divorcing is an extremely malignant, malevolent personality type, or we could just say a very disturbed, problematic personality type. Or maybe just, a spoiled bitch who's throwing a tantrum or whatever, right? Whatever the archetype is of the adversarial divorce partner, right? I understand how hard it is to keep your side of things up. But what you have to remember, and this is really the key, is that every concession that you make within reason, I'm not talking even now about finances. I mean, talk about that in a little while, but I'm just saying, like, in general, thinking about different modes of divorce, different models of divorce, adversarial versus a more concessional, cooperative style. If you can reorient your thinking from every concession that I make to my ex is a concession to my ex, and realize instead that every concession you make to your ex is a concession to you, your future self, and your children. Not always, perhaps. And again, I'm not talking necessarily money, but I'm talking about an attitudinal shift that keeps in mind not only the long story, right, the long game, but that also takes some comfort from the fact that if you conduct yourself well during the split, and if you go through, quote, a good divorce, then you can come out of this and your kids can come out of it in a positive way, as opposed to thinking of it in the other unproductive and, frankly, I think inaccurate way of like, oh, well, it's all fucked up now. I just don't agree with that. So that's one thing that I want to talk about, or that I wanted to bring up, is the idea of this attitudinal shift. And, something that I got from one of these books that I was looking at, there was a book called The Good Divorce. I mentioned it earlier. And she got into this question of what you do when you are the reasonable person in the divorce and you're in this adversarial process with a crazy ex or an asshole ex or a narc ex or whatever, right? And what she said was that even in that situation, it is still far better for the children and for the unfolding of the divorce process to have one parent who remains sane and calm and civil. And that when you divorce, it is more true perhaps than when you were married. When you divorce, you should realize that you are still contained on your side of the street, and then your adversarial ex is on their side of the street, and that no matter how messed up or junky or chaotic the other side of the street gets, you can keep your side of the street orderly and clean and nice, and your children will still benefit from having had one sane parent. I thought that was really great advice. It's kind of a Zen way of looking at divorce, where just like we talk about when we're talking about Buddhism, we're talking about Zen meditation, a certain orientation of transcendence, recognizing, yes, these are the conditions of what I'm going through. Yes, these are problematic conditions. There are things to be concerned about, things to focus on, and yet transcending it in such a way that ultimately still is better for you and your children. Okay. AJ says, 2000 Maddie, you've helped me so much. Wow. Well, I appreciate that. You telling me that. We'll talk more in a minute here. You said I would love an advice show where you consider readers' questions. Yeah, that's a good idea. So maybe I'll advertise that in the next few days. That's a good idea too. What do people want to hear about? AJ says, talking about each side of the street just reminds me of the TV show Rescue Me. Ex-husband lives across the street from the ex-wife just to be near his children. What a crazy show. That's the one with Dennis Leary, right? I think I saw a few episodes of that and liked it. I do recognize that there are huge legal considerations, and there's a huge labyrinthine industry centered around family court and divorces, and that there are tons of problems that people on both sides have. Yes, I know that there are a number of ways in which men really get shafted. I have to say also, though, as someone who saw the process from the perspective of my mother, because I was living with her the whole time, there are many ways too, perhaps less perceptible and sometimes, but sometimes very perceptible, where women deal with a lot of shit in the system as well, or mothers deal with a lot of shit in the system as well. And so I'm not here to litigate all of that. And I'll just, again, plead ignorance about a lot of things related to divorce. But again, I'm interested in this in more of a kind of a philosophical sense. So, is marriage this superior state of living that if you do not achieve it, or if you're in one and then it falls apart, then you basically have become a sort of inferior human being whose life now is kind of a situation of like, well, yeah, whatever, right? That's how a lot of people really do feel after divorce. And, you know, as someone who hasn't ever been married and is, I would think, probably not going to get married, I do tend to, I know, look at the institution in a more cynical way at times, but there can be something kind of freeing about that as well, where you can see aspects of something that maybe other people are not as tuned into. And so what I would say is, if you're interested in this question of whether it's better to be married or whether a married life is a better life than a single life, or a life even not married, a life just with someone coupled up is better than a life without, I really don't think that. I do think that generally speaking, it's better for kids. Now that's a different thing. It's better for kids to have two parents who are decent people and get along. But what happens often is that people get married and they have kids, and those factors are not present. Either one of them or both of them are not decent parents, or they don't get along, or there's some other significant issue, right? But I do think, though, from an existential perspective, that there is nothing superior about romantic love, a life of romantic love versus one that is without romantic love. And if you want to see more of my thoughts on that, I'll try to attach it below. There's a video that I did called, oh God, it was something about, is it bad to be single? If I tell you what, if you go to my other channel, Colonel Kurtz 99, and you look at my playlist under philosophy videos, there's one where I talk about, or have you missed your soulmate? Something like that. Something along those lines is the title. And I talk about this idea. But I do think that there is a reason why, for example, in the Bible, in the New Testament, it says that it's better if someone can abstain from sin, right? Fornication. It's better to not be married. And this is actually one of the reasons why, of course, Catholic priests, for example, and nuns are not allowed to be married. Now, I know that can have a lot of problems attracting perhaps some of the wrong kinds of people, right, to the institution. But the point that was being made in the Bible, the New Testament, is the fact that when one gets married, or when one even enters into a relationship like what I have, a committed, intense, long-term relationship, that it does put a great deal of one's focus and attention on one human being. And that's not always the most productive way of being in the world, or even the most necessarily humanitarian way of being in the world. You know, if you think about the significance that one attaches to one person, if one were not in that relationship, then a lot of that, as Freud calls it, libido, which just means interest, energy, not necessarily sexual, right? But one's libido, when one only has, leave it this way, in a psychoanalytic sense, we only have a certain amount of libido. And libido meaning psychic energy. Not, people think of it now, libido is like sex drive, but in a more earlier psychoanalytic sense, it's one's psychic energy, one's psychic focus, the thing that keeps people going, right, in life, interested, engaged in life. We only have a certain amount of it. And so when, metaphorically speaking, right, and so when you enter into a primary romantic relationship with someone, then a great deal of your libido, so to speak, your psychic energy and your attention goes toward that. Whereas if you are not invested in that, then there have to be outlets for this energy. And so you get, as you know, you get more involved maybe with friends or family or causes or your work or what have you, right? And so I think that's very much what the New Testament writer, was it Paul writing that letter? I can't remember, but New Testament writer was getting at in this admission that, yes, it's better not to be married if you can do it without sinning, right? Without having a lot of sex, basically, was his conclusion there. So that's what I would say about that. If you want to hear more about what I have to say on that topic, then again, you can look at my playlist and find the one where I was talking about relationships and soulmates and stuff like that. I think that I will say this. I think that staying in a marriage with someone where you are consistently very unhappy or very anxiety ridden. What do I mean by anxiety ridden? Well, we all know that there are certain types of people that make us feel more anxious than other types. And so we just all know that, right? There are people, we get into a room with them or we get into a conversation with them. And like by the end of the conversation, we're like, it just drives me crazy. Or I get nervous whenever I'm talking to this person or what have you, right? Well, in long-term relationships and marriages, what happens is you can go through a period where initially there's so much attraction there for someone that it overrides these other unpleasantries, or maybe in some way even makes them kind of appealing, right? If you find someone attractive as like a real abrasive personality or whatever, right? Because that can code as kind of strength. And it's not just in a one-sided way. We talk about men and women. There are a lot of men who are attracted to crazy, bitchy women because it is in some way stimulating or interesting or what have you, or in their minds, it connects them back to their abusive mothers or, like an Amber Heard, Johnny Depp situation. So, this can go both ways. We tend to think of it more of like the woman feeling anxious around the man, but really it can go both ways. But what happens over time is that these things can really become quite unpleasant long-term. And so like my mother, for instance, her relationship with my father, she was very attracted to his he's a really good looking guy too, but very attracted to his masculinity. And he is more experienced in a lot of ways than the other guys that she met in college. He had been to Vietnam and come back and things like that. And so there was a real sort of ruggedness, masculinity, and a real sort of hyper masculine character that she was attracted to. Right. And they got married. Well, what happened was over time is she discovered that, at least in that case, what came along with those attributes she likes was a real extreme emotional coldness and a narcissism, and over time, a temper that got worse and worse. And so I think that it's unfortunate when you go online, you go on Twitter, and you see these men's rights activists claiming that most divorces are initiated by women. I mean, they are, but not by like a gigantic margin, but they are. Most divorces are initiated by women, and that women do it for frivolous reasons. They do it for irreconcilable differences or incompatibility. I really think that it's insulting to those women, and frankly to everyone, to assume that having a deep incompatibility of character or temperament, or having a relationship dynamic that is just continually upsetting or depressing or anxiety producing, that these things are just no big deal and you should just live with it, bitch. I just think that's a really problematic way of looking at this. Oh, AJ, you found the video. Thank you. Here we go. So if y'all look in the comments, should you give up on finding your soulmate? There it is. And then there was a part 2 of that video too. I also talked about the twin flame stuff. And at some point in a minute, I'm going to talk about Jennifer Lopez, so I can put that on the the thumbnail. Dan, thank you so much. YouTube won't let you? Yeah, that's funny. YouTube won't let you say it. Huh? 1 second. Aw, thank you so much. Appreciate you. Kurtz, I think that society is changing on multiple levels, and especially as virtual reality becomes available, many of the reasons we get together with a romantic partner will be obviated by the fantasies we can indulge in with that technology. Oh, abso-fucking-lutely. Our world is about to get just completely shaken up. In so many ways, and we all know this with AI, with technology, it's already starting to happen. Is it going to be, and I've talked about it with like anti-aging as well, like what's it going to do to relationships if people are able to live many, many more decades and be hot and be sexual and, stuff like that? I mean, what's that going to do? So there's a lot going on there. So definitely. Oh, and thank you, yes, for advertising the PayPal tip jar and also the Patreon. The Patreon, I'm not doing hardly anything with it right now, but I'm going to try to put more stuff up. But if you just want to send a PayPal tip or whatever, this video is also going to go up on a version of it was going to go up on my main YouTube channel, and you can just do like a super chat or a thanks to. Okay. So I absolutely just deny that it is illegitimate for someone to divorce someone um, in non-abuse, non-cheating situations. I think that I really think that most divorce is not frivolous, that the person who initiates it, generally speaking, is doing so when they just really don't see any hope or they're into the rope. But that's not always true. Certainly there are very narcissistic people who, as we know, almost at the drop of a hat, will tire of someone or will move on to the next shiny object. But I just reject in general this narrative that there's just a glut of people out there, particularly self-entitled bitches, thinking getting a divorce just out of a mere sense of, I'm not fulfilled. I'm waiting for Fabio from the cover of my latest romantic novel to come and sweep me away. I mean, come on. I just don't think so. When I was young and my mom was in this really emotionally abusive, toxic situation with my dad, she didn't like to watch romantic movies in general, or like with me, if I wanted to watch a romantic movie for some reason. I don't like the genre either, probably because I grew up, not really seeing a great romantic relationship pattern in front of me. But she didn't like watching romantic movies or soap operas or things like that, because she said that it made her much more painfully aware of the gulf between her relationship and a happier one. And I know that there are like men's rights activists who will point that out. They'll point out these statistics that say that the more that people hear romantic stories or watch romantic movies, then the more dissatisfied they become with their relationships and they get a divorce and stuff. Art is powerful, perhaps on some small level, that's true. But I just think back to someone like my mom, who honestly, it would have been better for her, and I think for us kids, if she had come to those realizations a little bit sooner, right? So I don't know. Everybody has to decide for themselves what is frivolous and what is not, and how much they think it's harming their children to be exposed to toxic patterns, because people do emulate what they saw in their childhood. They just do. Maybe not always, but they do. And so, when you're divorcing, you're saying on the one hand, well, I'm patterning divorce for my children, but are you also patterning for your children having standards, or not accepting certain things, or not staying in a crummy, horrible marriage and not being unhappy for 18 years? Like, not unhappy in a frivolous sense, but like deeply like unhappy, I don't know. These are things people have to figure out for themselves, but I think you can probably get a sense of what I feel about it. This question that we get down to, do you choose yourself or do you choose your children? What I'm trying to say there is that I don't think it's that simple. And I think that there are ways in which you can continue to choose your children, even under the umbrella of something very destabilizing like divorce. So that's what I want to talk about then right now is, okay, if you're getting a divorce, then how can you conduct yourself in such a way so that it is as non-damaging for your children as possible, so that it's something that you can feel like you went down that path, conducted yourself in a way that you can feel good about. All right. So these are some things that I wanted to think that I was thinking about. I think that the existential challenge here is how to separate while also facing the fact and facing it cheerfully that you are going to remain joined with this person as long as you have these kids, and at least as long as you have, court ordered shared custody or what have you, right? But maybe longer. There was a book that I was reading about divorce, and it was talking about how this woman had a really this woman and this man had a really acrimonious divorce. very toxic, and that after the divorce, they just could not stand to be in each other's company. And so after a few years, their oldest daughter was going to get married. And the oldest daughter had always dreamed about having a really big wedding. And so the parents were surprised when she announced to them that she was going to basically elope and was not going to have a wedding. And she told them that the reason for that was because she did not want to have a wedding with parents who obviously hated each other and couldn't stand to be around each other, and were creating all of these points of anxiety for her, trying to figure out how to placate them both, make them both happy, what have you. And the mother of the bride was so disturbed by this that she called the father, her ex, and said, let's go to counseling. And they went to 3 counseling sessions. And no, they didn't come out of the counseling sessions being in love with each other again or loving each other's company. But they got some reality checks. They got some different perspectives than they might have gotten. And they had a forum where they could talk through some things, to the point where their relationship was improved enough that the daughter felt comfortable going ahead with the big wedding that she wanted, that the mom wanted, I guess. Now, that might not be practical for everyone, particularly, again, if your spouse is someone who's so toxic that they won't even go to therapy with you, or if they go to therapy with you, they're just conning the therapist the whole time, or what have you, right? But I do think that it shows us that you can't, if you're getting a divorce, you can't be in denial about the fact that you are linked to this person. And so that is one dimension of this topic where I would say, okay, if you're thinking that you can just make a clean cut, then your head's kind of in the clouds on that, or you're deluding yourself. Because, and I'm talking about when you have kids, I'm not talking about if you don't have kids, then, unless you're having to continue to run a business together, like J-Lo and Ben Affleck, who apparently are connected through a number of business ventures that his production company is linked to with her. But unless you're having to continue a business venture together, or your families have become, your extended families become like so intertwined or something, or your friend set is just so intertwined that you're going to have to continue to see that person or deal with them. I mean, if you don't have kids, then it's fine. So of course I'm talking to people who have children, but you do have to be realistic, and it may suck and it may be really a downer to consider, but you do have to consider that you are linked to this person for the rest of your life. Just like, a lot of us might be linked to parents that we don't want to be linked to for the rest of our life, right? And of course, you can stop talking to someone, you can become estranged from them, but there's still that way in which they're still, particularly if you have children together, they're going to be in your life for a while. And so I think that that's definitely something that one has to come to terms with. Sorry, my nose is running a little bit. 1 second, I'll be back. 2 minutes. I'll come back like Kata. Speaking of family, issues. So here's what I would say. All right. My perception of going through this separation that my parents went through is that the things that are most damaging to a child are the things that point to a real destabilization in their lives, psychologically, emotionally. So I'll tell you several. First of all, it is really rough on a kid to have to witness or perceive negative emotions by the parents about the divorce or about the situation. And I say that because I think about the things that were really traumatic for me about my parents' separation. And I also look at what some of the research indicates. And it seems like children, their experience of a divorce is very much keyed into how they perceive that the parents are experiencing it. And so if the parents present this to the children with all of this angst and all of this emotional sense of emotional trauma and sadness and grievance with the other parent and anger at the other parent and self-pity. Ooh, self-pity is just so bad. So bad for the kids to perceive from the parent. If this is what's being fed to the kid, then of course this is the orientation then with which the kid will go into the process of the experience of the divorce, right? So what I'm saying there, and so like for instance, with my parents, my mom on her end, there were a number of financial problems that arose because, well, both parents, right? Because divorce is expensive, and you got now two different households running on the same amount of income and all of that. But with my mom, it was just a lot of she would get stressed out, and then she would start crying, and she would say, "I'm 50 years old and my life is over and no one's gonna." And she didn't say that very often, and she really tried not to get into that. But sometimes she would just have some of these like breakdowns or whatever. And then on my dad's end, he was much, much less careful than my mom to try to shield us from the negative stuff. And so we would go over to his house and his apartment, and he was mopey and sad, and he would cry or pretend to cry. He was very narcissistic, but and it was just like we didn't even want to go be around him because you're just feeling guilty the whole time, right? Even though, of course, it had nothing to do with my sister and me, but when you're a kid and you're sort of in this tug of war between parents, and even if it's subtle, there's this feeling that you can get that your parents can give off that they're not even maybe aware. Like in my mom's case, that she was doing it. My dad much more so, I think, consciously. But there's this feeling that parents can give off that it's incumbent upon the children somehow to make this situation better. And so if the dad is really, for instance, if the dad is really bummed out about not being able to spend as much time with the kids as he wants, even if that's legitimate, let's say he's in one of these nightmare court battles with the wife and he's getting much less custody than he's supposed to, or what have you, right? But if the dad is acting around the kids like he's miserable and bummed out, the kids as human beings, they want to feel like they can do something to make that better. There's got to be something that we can do to make this better. And what they also feel is almost a sense of survivor's guilt. How can I be happy? How can I move forward cheerfully? How can I be enjoying my childhood or my teenage years when my parents are miserable, right? And so that is a hard pill to swallow, I know, for divorced or divorcing parents, because what it puts on you is that, and here I'm just going to say it, yes, you do have to become an actor around your children. You do. At least so far as to get them through, the hard years of the divorce, and then maybe you can come down from that a little, or you can come down from that or what have you. I'm not saying for the rest of your life, but I'm saying for the most traumatic parts of that, potentially traumatic parts of that process, the years immediately after the divorce, while they're a couple of years while they're stabilizing, you really do need to shield your kids from the reality of whatever you're feeling, negatively speaking. And I'm not talking about pretending to the extent of like, oh, I'm just so happy now, or not some like crazy unhinged psychotic person. But I'm talking about just as much as possible, keeping your grief and your sadness or your anger or your sense of outrage or injustice or whatever, keeping those things to yourself. And the way that you do that is by finding appropriate outlets for them. And unfortunately, what happens often when people separate or divorce, is that they go into a kind of retractive mode where it's like, okay, this big thing in my life has now gotten fucked up, and all my friends know about it. They know that I've failed, and we have these mutual friends now, and it's awkward, and all of this and that. And so it's just like, I just want to get away from people. I just want to retract. But what happens is you also, at the same time, you have all of these perhaps negative feelings. If you're having an amicable divorce, then great. But a lot of people having all these negative feelings swirling around, and they're going to come out. And so who do they come out with? Even perhaps almost imperceptibly, unintentionally, they come out with your kids. And so that is why it is helpful to try to engage with and develop your other relationships, friends, family, even if you normally don't like talking to your mother, maybe you start calling your mother up and talking to her if you have one, or whatever, or get if you can afford it, get a therapist. I know that the idea of therapy is just being completely shredded up right now online and social media and society. And there are books now coming out about how therapy makes it worse because you're just ruminating over your problems, and it's actually enabling problems, and it's making people more navel gazing and focused on themselves, et cetera, and all of that, right? But let me just tell you, y'all, like marriage, if you go into it with realistic expectations, often therapy can be very productive or helpful, and not in the way that it can revolutionize your life or fix your problems. I don't think it can, but in the way that it can facilitate a more happy, a more clear-eyed self-assessment and help you to sort of level off your emotions with other people, because you have someone that you can unload that stuff to and express that stuff to. So if you're going through a bad divorce and you're pissed or you're depressed or you're having these problems with your ex, find someone that you can talk to regularly so that stuff is not seeping out of you onto your kids. And yes, realize that you're going to need to perform to an extent around your children, and that doesn't mean that you're being fake or that you're not showing them reality or whatever. It just means that you're trying to mitigate the damage, their emotional damage, as much as possible, and turn it into a situation that can be more or less shrugged off as they age, right? I also think that it's important for parents to keep in mind that there is a difference perceived by kids between a feminine and a masculine parent, and that children really, ideally, especially if they've grown up in a family so far with a mother and a father, they are going to really want to continue to feel both of those presences in their lives. And so that is why it's important, as much as parents can, to be amicable about shared custody. Now, I understand if one parent is really, truly toxic, abusive, problematic, can't have as much time with the child for that reason, or if there's an issue with location, living totally different places, and one parent just can't see the child as much. But your child needs masculine and feminine influences, men and women, important in their lives. And so if a father or a mother are going to be, for whatever reason, even self-induced, sidelined in the child's life, then the child needs other figures to step in. I also think that we have to realize that one of the problems with a single parent situation, a single parent family, is that basically it becomes a situation where you have the tyranny of one. And what I mean by that is that there's no longer another parent to balance out the inclinations or the eccentricities or the biases or the problems of the other parent. When you have two parents, then one parent can help make up for or course correct for or compensate for the weaknesses or problematic aspects of the other parent. But then in a single parent situation, then, whether we're talking about the person who has primary custody or we're talking about a situation where the kids go to spend weekends or off weeks with the other parent, in these situations, both of these situations, the kids now don't have a second person to look toward to balance out the issues of the parent that they're with. And so when you're hanging out with mom, it's pretty much mom's world. And when you're hanging out with dad, it's dad's world. And I think that parents need to be very cognizant of that and really try to conduct themselves in such a way when they're with their children, even alone with their children, that they will be cognizant of the fact that the children will miss the presence of the counterbalancing parent. And, even in situations where one parent might be abusive or problematic much more than the other parent, there are still aspects of that person that the kids will miss at times. In my experience with my family, my dad, very problematic, emotionally abusive personality, but there were times when I wish that he was there sometimes to balance out some of my mom's issues, whatever those might be, right? None of us are perfect. And so that to me is one of the real problems with divorce and with single parent situations that needs to be faced and understood, is that it can become much more oppressive for the children to perceive that they're now living under the tyranny of one when they're hanging out with either parent, right? And the thing is, people will start playing these people because the parents at times can be so pissed at each other. They'll start playing all of these mind games with each other through the divorce process, losing sight of the fact that they are hurting the children. You know, my dad was pissed about the money that he had to give my mom when they separated, or no, he was trying to guilt trip her about leaving him or something. And so he got a job, a second job, to bring in extra income to our family. So my dad was an administrator at a local college. Um, and he could have taken on like courses to teach, like college courses to teach for extra money or what have you, or there was a number of things he could have done. But he got a job next door to our house sacking groceries at the local grocery store, Food Lion. They even have Food Lions now. And some of you might think it's appalling what I'm about to say, but let me explain myself. This embarrassed the hell out of me that my dad was sacking groceries at Food Lion. And some of you are going to say, get off your classist high horse. No, I'm a server, a waitress now at a restaurant, and I don't think that there's anything. Having come through years and years of schooling and gotten my PhD, I see just how often worthless white collar pursuits can be, to put it that way. But at the time, y'all, like, nobody in my friend set. So the school that I went to was very upper class. Most people in my friend group were from families that were wealthier, had more money than my, lower middle class family had. Especially the school that I went to, there were really rich, like old oil money families there in Texas and so forth. And so it was embarrassing to me, yes, because no one in my friend or social set had parents doing blue collar, quote unquote, blue collar work like that. And certainly as a fully actualized adult now, if something like that were to happen, I would shrug it off, or I'd be okay with it. But from that perspective, it was very embarrassing, particularly because there's a lot of other things that he could have done. But here's what was going on. He was pissed at my mom, and he was trying to embarrass her because he knew that would embarrass her too, right? All their friends, their high class lawyer, doctor, old oil money friends, and they see her ex, my dad, sacking groceries in Food Lion. I mean, it was a very passive aggressive thing to have done on his part. And so my point being there that he thought that and he's a narcissistic person, but he thought that he was really in some way sticking it to my mom on some level. But again, really, it was doing something that was unnecessarily traumatic for the kids, from my perspective, right? I remember my mom had me seeing a counselor at that point, and I believe the counselor lectured me for basically being a classist bitch. Well, he didn't say you classist bitch, but that was basically the tenor of it, is why should you be embarrassed about your dad sacking groceries? But I mean, contextually speaking, it was embarrassing. I don't know, not my favorite therapist back then. Anyway, so don't play the mind games. Put on a decent performance for your kids. It doesn't have to last forever, but for a couple of years till things stabilize, until they see that it's going to be okay. This isn't going to be such a horrible deal. And I'll say something else, and this is going to be hard for some of you, and I totally understand. And maybe in your case, your ex is so toxic or so problematic, like that you shouldn't do this. You can't do this. You shouldn't do what I'm about to say. But I do think that it is important for the kids to continue to be able to hang out with their parents in the presence of each other, where the parents are in each other's presence. And I say that because that was one of the things that was hard for me, that I perceived when they separated, and even in the years after, as being difficult, is this feeling that you still wanted to have some sense of this continued family unit. If nothing else, just the idea that you had these two important people who were still on board and in your corner and willing to fight for you together, right? As a united front, just stronger, a sense of strength, a sense of security, knowing that there was still some kind of united front there with the parents, even if they can't stand each other. And I really feel like it would have been nice. My parents didn't do this, weren't able to do this. And because my dad was very toxic in a lot of ways, it probably wouldn't have been a great idea. But it would have been nice if, for at least several years after the divorce, if they could have continued to, I'm not saying you have to take like family vacations together, but like if they could have continued to have some occasions where like we could hang out with the two of them and have this feeling that if something bad happened, you still had these two people together who would take care of you in some way. I don't know how to put it's very primal, right? And so it's very hard to put into words because it's much more in the realm of like metaphor than actuality. But I think if there's ways you can do that, it's helpful. I also think that it's helpful if the kid gets when the kid is around the parents. I think it's helpful if that happens on in environments or in locations that are familiar to the kid. And so like I remember when my parents separated, I hated going to my dad's apartment because it felt like it was just this alien place. And I'm not saying the apartment looked alien. I mean, it was fine, but it was just this new alien place that sort of signaled to me that everything's changed. And now your dad is in this new place. And when you go visit him, you have to be in this new place that you're not familiar with. And also it really impressed on me the sense that I was just visiting over there, that I really wasn't still a part of his life. And of course he was a narcissist and emotionally abusive. So in some ways, you know, I didn't want to be a part of his life, but it's very much a point of conflict when you're growing up with a narcissistic parent, this feeling that at the same time, you do still want to be close to them. You do still want to have that sense of them in your life. And so it was this very disorienting thing to have to go to this new location. And it just felt like I was almost in some kind of like a prison visiting room or something. I don't know how else to put it, but that's what I felt when I went over to my dad's apartment, that it's like, okay, here I'm at home still with my mom in the home that we grew up in. And this is our family. And then I go over to this depressed, you know, mopey person's house and sit there, and it's depressing and it's this weird environment. And that's the thing that I remember not liking. Now, what can you do about that? I mean, that's what I was saying. Maybe find locations that the children are comfortable with. Or if the children, maybe even grandparents' houses, if they have more of a background with those locations or something. I don't know. I have a couple of friends who do the house swapping thing or the rotation thing, where they each will live in the same house with their kids, but they swap out weeks. And so he'll be there. So the kids never moved. The kids stayed in the house. And I understand a lot of people financially can't afford this, or it's weird, or they can't do it. But I'm just saying the kids stayed in the house, and there was an apartment that the parents, I don't know if they would each go to the same apartment or if they had their own or what was going on there. But that's what they did. This was several years ago. That's what they would do, is the kids would stay at the same house that they had grown up in, and the parents would rotate. And then eventually, you know, they stopped doing that. But just to give them a sense of continuity, right? I know it's not practical for everyone, but I'm just saying that it is important. And this is why I was saying earlier that the challenge is how to separate while remaining joined. And you can fight that sense of being joined, and you can deny it, and you can say, I want him out of my life or her completely out of my life, exit out. You kids may have to deal with that pariah, with that asshole, with that bitch, with that lunatic, but no, I'm out of my life. That is just it's not productive. Unless, of course, we're talking about someone who really is just so toxic that if they're going to they're going to put you through some kind of emotional ringer, or they just can't hang out with you in any kind of civil way in public, right? I think it's good, at least for the first couple of years, to have occasions early in the process, if possible, where the parents are still hanging out with the kids in some kind of congenial way. If you can't, you can't. You know, I think that it was unfortunate how people really belittled Gwyneth Paltrow and Chris Martin, the Coldplay guy. They really belittled them when they announced that they were undergoing a conscious uncoupling. And I understand, look, Gwyneth Paltrow, she is like the epitome of the elite, like out of touch celebrity. And, you know, she had that candle that smelled like her vagina. What was up with that? It was a scented candle, and it was called My Vagina, and it was supposed to, I don't know. I don't even want to think about it beyond that because it makes me kind of ill. But I totally get why people make fun of her. But at the same time, it was kind of unfortunate to me that she became the kind of cultural standard bearer, so to speak, of the idea of a conscious uncoupling, because unfortunately that made a lot of people think that that became the only paradigm through which people could think about having a productive divorce. It was like, oh, come on, are you talking about that conscious uncoupling, Gwyneth Paltrow stuff? The new agey term, it sounds silly. And of course, Gwyneth Paltrow is a horrible standard bearer because she's so annoying to people. But it really is a good paradigm, I think. If you can think about the time that you spent together, not as time thrown in a trash basket, but rather as a time in which that a time that was productive because it taught you a lot about the world, and it taught you about other people, and it taught you about yourself, and it gave you a lot of valuable experiences. If you can refashion your perspective on your marriage, even if it was short-lived, it didn't last, even if it was an unhappy marriage, even if it was a toxic marriage, even if it was an abusive marriage. And I'm not trying to say like, oh, an abusive marriage is okay because you'll learn a lot from it. No, obviously the abusive marriage is one to be avoided if one has the foresight. But I think we all understand that you learn a tremendous amount about life and about yourself, and you can grow spiritually a tremendous amount through suffering and negative experiences. And that even in negative experiences with people, we learn a lot. These are profound experiences. And they're profound for your children as well, because they will have had that time to have experienced what it was like to have had two parents together, and hopefully through the way that you separate, the way that you divorce, you will give them then a more positive filter through which to look back at that marriage. In other words, this is what I'm trying to say. If you get a divorce and you don't try to have a good divorce, and it's shitty and painful, and people don't make an effort and what have you, then that basically it fossilizes your marriage as a negative thing in your mind and your children's mind going forward. But even if the marriage was difficult, even if it was very problematic, if you can go through the divorce in a healthy way, then that really in a lot of ways will help to solidify a kind of a more positive, peaceful perspective of your relationship. So I think that the beauty of the conscious uncoupling idea, and you see this again reflected in research about the effect of divorce on children, is that it is the idea that instead of the end of your marriage being a failure, it is simply the end of your path, your road with that person, as you now go into a different phase of life or onto a different path. And if you can present this to your children, look, a lot of the way that your children will perceive this is how you pitch it to them. You need to think about you and your husband, or you and your wife. Your job as divorcing parents, one of your jobs is to be a kind of a salesperson pitching an idea to your kids. And the idea that you're pitching to your kids is not necessarily that divorce is a great thing, or that this is what you should, be striving for as you're married for a few years or whatever, and then you split or whatever. But pitching to them the idea that this divorce is not a wholly negative thing, that in fact there are good things that will be achieved. There are some good outcomes that will come from this. I think you should spell that out. I think you should sit down when you divorce. I think you should sit down with your kids like a business person sitting down to pitch a deal to his board of directors or whatever. In other words, hey kids, look, this is why we're doing this. As you know, been having these arguments, we've grown into two different people, or whatever. I don't know, whatever you want to say. This is what's been going on. No, don't get into your dad cheated on me with the maid or something or anything like that, right? You don't have to tell everything. And there's a lot you shouldn't be telling, right? But kids, they already probably know what's going on anyway in a lot of ways. But you say, this is what's going on. So look, we've decided it is the best thing for us because we want to continue. We want to move on and both be great, happy, or at peace parents. And we cannot continue to do that. Our relationships with you cannot continue in the ways that are most positive and productive if we are still connected in this marriage. So we're going to divorce. We're going to dissolve this marriage. This is what it means to us. This is what it doesn't mean to us. It doesn't mean that this and this and this and this. This is what it means. And these are some of the upsides and the downsides that we can expect. And then you try to mitigate, you explain to them how you are going to try to mitigate the downsides. You might, and pointing out the upsides, you might say, well, what are the upsides? Well, I mean, there are upsides. The upside is going to be that if there was a lot of toxicity, or if one or both of the parents seemed miserable, or there was a lot of anxiety or what have you, that's not going to continue. And you should conduct yourself from that point on around your kids in such a way so that they see that that's not continuing. Because if it does continue, then they're going to say to themselves, oh, well, the divorce didn't really do anything. I mean, they're still angry or upset or depressed, right? Another positive to separation or divorce is that it does create these particular times when children can have very focused attention from the parent that they're with. And if the parent treats it like that, and not like my dad, for instance, treated it, where my time with the kids is just to kind of make them feel miserable or to reinforce to them that I'm miserable. But, more than anything, often what children want, up to a certain age perhaps, but what children want is the focused attention and involvement of their parents. And often, as we know how life is, your attention is going to be all over the place throughout your life, and it's very hard to give your kids focused attention. But one of the things that divorce does do, I would say one of the silver linings in the separation of the parents, is that the time that the children have with each parent can be much more focused and much more targeted. Not like we have an agenda, but just like, wow, I don't get to see you as much, or I don't live with you as much, or I live with you half the time, or maybe not even most of the time. I love you. Let's do fun things together. Let's spend time. Experiences in life and relationships really are generally more about quality than quantity. And my favorite person to hang out with when I was a little kid was my uncle. And one of the, probably from my past, from my childhood, the person that for many years was most important to me, but he didn't live with me. But the time that I was with him, the time that I was around him, it was wonderful and it was magical, and he was really invested in me, right? And so that's what I'm saying. And so there are things that you can pitch to your kids about this change. And it doesn't mean that you're BSing them, that you're bullshitting them. It means that you're showing them that actually this can be handled in such a way so that there's some things that you're going to see some value in. There's some things that you're going to like. There's some ways in which things are going to get better. And that is how divorce should be pitched to the kids, as a way that you are going to make the family unit stronger. Seriously. And the way to make that stronger is that the parents, yes, they have this separation, but it is only so that they can be a much stronger, happier, healthier unit for the children. So that the family, and I'm telling you, this is just from some books that I've read too, and stuff that I've gleaned from the research. The children want to feel like the family remains unified, even as it is clear that the parents are no longer united in a romantic relationship. Now, again, I have all the sympathy for people who have toxic exes, narcissistic, abusive, and you say, like, there's just no way I can do this. Totally understand that. But even with that, you can continue on your own. As the one sane parent, you can continue to hold down the fort, so to speak, and you can continue to pitch this in a way that is positive. And yes, you can't control the pain that the other parent will put them through, but you can keep up your end of things, and you will still be making a valiant effort for your children that will pay off and will make you feel better, frankly, one day on your deathbed. Oh my God, an hour and 30 minutes. It's time to go. I think that's everything I wanted to say, honestly. I will say one more thing. Two more things. For those for whom it is possible, the sooner that you move into a friendship relationship, a friendship phase with your ex-spouse, then the sooner the pressure on your children can be eased, the sooner the anxiety and the agitation that they might feel from this great upheaval in their lives, the sooner that can be eased or that can be taken away, right? And so your goal, as much as possible, as much as you can, I'm not saying you have to concede everything or whatever, and I know that the details are much messier than the picture that I'm painting here, but if you can, a lot of you who are getting divorced, even if you don't feel friendly with your ex or you don't feel any warmth toward them right now, a lot of you in the years to come, you will get to a place eventually where you do. And I'll tell you something, my dad, he died of Alzheimer's a year ago. And I was not there, but my mom and my sister went to his deathbed, so to speak. And I don't know if he died like maybe weeks later after they visited or not, or if it was just days before. But they went to his deathbed, and my sister wanted to go, and my mom wanted to go and support her. But he was really out of it, as people are in the final stages of dementia, right? I don't have to explain that. Super, super out of it. Not really, as they say, not really tracking anything, right? And at one point, my mom went over to him. They just told me this. I wasn't there. My mom went over to him and she took his hand. He was lying in the bed, just totally not there, right? Took his hand and she started telling, I believe the nurse who was present started telling her some stories about some old family memories and like good memories between the two of them or within our family, I think. Something like that. Started talking about positive things. And my sister said, Mom, look, he's tracking you. And he had turned, his eyes were looking at her, and he was clinging to her hand, and he was totally, totally focused in on her in a way that was indicative of a real warmth of feeling there. And I think that ultimately, I think when we die, if there is a God, and if what we're doing here does matter, I do think that ultimately that is what we'll see. That yes, under these imperfect, horrible conditions of this horrible fallen world that we're in, relationships get really messed up and people get really messed up and they do horrible things to each other and they're fucked up and whatever. But underlying all of that is still this kind of deeper, transcendent communion of spirit between people. And we go through these experiences, and years later, we're able to eventually come together like that when it matters. So I think if you can try to keep that in your mind, even as this person is irritating the hell out of you in the divorce process, if you can keep that in mind and keep a sense of the transcendent or the sacred, I think that's what it means when people say till death do us part. I think that's what those vows mean. I don't think it means literally stay together till the end, but that we are creating a kind of a sacred union that in some form or fashion, the most beautiful elements of that and the most meaningful elements of that will persist into the future. That's what I think. So, and the last thing I want to say is about regret. The last thing I want to say is about regret, because I think that one of the things that's really hard for people going through a divorce is this ambivalence, this feeling of being sort of stuck in the middle of wanting the divorce, but also not wanting it, or going forward with the divorce, but having this nagging feeling, what if you made the wrong decision? What if this is the wrong decision? And, it's kind of like an Apocalypse Now, if I can give a reference to my favorite movie. At the beginning of Apocalypse Now, Willard, the main character, Martin Sheen, he's talking about, he's sitting in a hotel room in Saigon, waiting to go on another mission because he's in the army, right, in the Vietnam War. And he talks about the anguish of feeling stuck in the middle. He says, when I'm in the jungle, when I'm at war, all I can think about is getting back home to my wife, right? to the States, to civilization. But then he says, as soon as I'm back home, all I can think about is getting into the jungle. And one of the existential difficulties of life that we deal with is that often, especially when we make big decisions of great importance, we can feel really torn apart over time. And so I think that once you commit to a divorce, I think you have to make peace with the fact that, of course, there's a possibility you made the wrong decision. And understand that one of the conditions of being a functional human being is that we have to, at a certain point, we have to move forward, even in the face of doubt, even in the face of ambivalence, even in the face of regret. And no, I'm not saying whether you should get a divorce or you shouldn't or whatever. And I'm not trying to simplify it and say, well, just get one and then don't worry about it. No, but I'm just saying that at a certain point, once you have made the decision in your mind, then release yourself from the fear that you made a mistake and move forward as best you can. And don't remain in the zone of ambivalence to such a degree that it's poisoning you. And I do believe that if there is a God and if there is a purpose to life, I do believe, as many religions like Christianity show us, that God is very much able to forgive our mistakes and is much more interested in our hearts and our action in the present and moving forward. So, all right. I appreciate y'all. I love y'all. It's been great. We'll see how much of my crying I end up editing out. I'm going to read your comments after I get off, but I got to go. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Maddie. Thank you, AJ. And I'm glad you enjoyed it. And yeah, bye, everybody.